This will be recorded. I'll release a kind of low fidelity version onto YouTube, and I'll be capturing a higher quality version for later use. So this is the second of our webinars. Here are the basic details if you need to get in touch. Twitter, evotest.com, and the main website's listed there. The one that's most important for this stuff is seleniumsimplified.com, because that's where I will be posting any updates on this. That's where the mailing list for all this stuff happens. So for this webinar series, what we're doing is we're basically working through a WebDriver project in Java, and we're doing everything as live as possible, and I'm going to comment as much as I can on the code, the decisions that I'm making, so you get a feel for how we develop and think through the process. Because the other training courses that I do really deal with the basics and the technical parts. What I want to deal with here are the thought processes that we use. Now, I have no idea when the next one is. It really depends when client work comes up. I'm trying to do them kind of every 2 weeks or so, but I'm not sure how often that's actually going to be. So here are the links. And by the way, I'm going to release all the slides and everything else that comes with this. All the source code will be released, and you'll see the notification on seleniumsimplified.com. So since this is the second, we have done some work already. The source has been released. You can find it on XPDev in the Subversion repository, WebDriver webinars. If you haven't seen the previous webinar, after this you might want to go and watch it on YouTube. And last time, we created a basic project. We looked at the login page in a browser and analyzed it for automation. We created a domain object to capture the basic user account. We created a basic test for logging in, and we did some basic refactoring on that test. So this time, what we're going to do is we're going to check that our tests still work. Then we're going to start refactoring that test into page objects. And I'm going to talk through the thought processes that I have behind page objects, and we'll probably discuss a little bit about how concerned I get about page objects sometimes. I think I get more concerned about page objects than other people. And I'm going to do whatever refactoring it takes to get this code in shape. So let's have a look at the code we have. Now, if you do download the source code, you'll see that I'm keeping notes on what I'm doing in each of the webinars in the README file. And we have a very simple test here. What this test basically does, you can see we've refactored it to use JUnit. So I'm starting up the driver in the before class. I create my domain objects before each test to make sure everything's clean. And then our login test basically finds some locators, does the work to log in. So we have a basic test here. We have a login test that uses the page locators. We go to the page, we log in, we do some work. Now remember, I am using Bitnami. And I'm using Bitnami in a virtual machine to host the Tracks application that we're testing. And we have a default user with a password on here, so that I know that everything is basically working. I like to use virtual machines in my tests. So now, let's rerun the test just to make sure everything is working. This is what we always do before we start doing anything else. Now, because I did this earlier, I know that the test is not going to work. And I'm just going to demonstrate to you that it's not going to work. So Firefox has come up, which is great, but it's not working. Now, the reason I'm putting you through the pain and seeing this is because this is going to happen to you a lot. Because if you're not controlling your test environment, then Firefox is going to update in the background, and it's going to get ahead of the WebDriver version. So the main issue here is that 2 weeks ago, when we did this, the most up-to-date version of WebDriver was 2.2.8. Now the most up-to-date version is 2.30, and WebDriver has been up, and Firefox has been updated at the same time. So I need to go in here into the POM file and update this to 2.3.0. Because I've got the Maven dependencies on automatically, it's downloading it, it's found it. So hopefully now when I run the test, it should work. Now, on a lot of forums, on a lot of the questions that come through in the course, when I'm out on client site and I'm seeing people and they're trying to run tests, if they have different versions of on their grid server or the machine they're running with compared to what they have locally, then when they're debugging tests and they put it through on the server and it doesn't work, the most common thing that I'm suggesting to them is simply making sure that your versions of Firefox and browsers are consistent across your dev machine and your server. And try and control the versions that are actually on your server, because then you don't have to keep updating to the next version of WebDriver until you're ready. So we've upgraded that. Our test works. Now we know that we're good to go. Because although we're not strictly doing test-driven development here, what we are doing is we have functional tests. And we will make sure that our functional tests keep running as we change the page object models and the tests we're doing. So it's not strictly test-driven at unit test level, but because I have tests, I can change the code without worrying too much about the impact. So let's have a quick look at what we've got here then. So we've got the basic test, which has comments, because last time we made comments about deciding what we were going to do next. So I partitioned this into how the code might look. And remember, we have a tracks object over here, which basically is a domain object for allowing me to deal with the user account. So question, will newer versions of Selenium run older versions? They should do, that's the aim, but sometimes the older version of the browser gets too far behind the actual WebDriver, and it won't. So you just have to take that into account. A lot of people try and do too much with WebDriver and try and test it against 1,000 different browsers at the same time, and really that's kind of pointless. What we want to do is make sure that we're targeting the tests that we need to check on each browser and make sure the versions are as much as we can handle with our maintenance. So let's go back to the test. Now we know that we want to do page objects. Normally I will write more than one test. Currently we have one test which says log into tracks. Normally I'd write a test that would fail to log in or some other test around the login process before I start dealing with page objects, because then I can justify their use. Now here, I'm just going to create a page object because I know that we're going to need some in the future. And what I'm trying to do is explain some of the patterns and thought processes. So I am going to start in a way that I start writing these things, which is I'm going to just write the code that I want to see in my test when I actually get there. So I know I'm going to want to get a login page. We don't have a login page yet. I'm going to say I want a login page called login page. So I'm going to create a new login page and pass in the driver to that. And the use that I'm going to make of this login page is I'm going to do login page dot type username. And I will pass in the username, which is going to be this one. I'm also going to want to type in the password. Now what I'm going to do, so how do I determine whether to use page object, page factory? I start with page objects. Later on, if I need to, I will refactor all this stuff and use a page factory. But I will start as simple as possible and keep it as simple as possible for as long as I possibly can. Now you can see that the code that I'm going to have when I create this page object is pretty much the same as I've got in the test up here when we refactored it, because I want to do pretty much the same thing. Now the page objects I use are going to be very basic. What I'm going to do is I'm using the page objects to model the physical world. So rather than overload them with too many methods, I know that with a page object, I need to abstract away the identification of this login field and abstract away the actual sending in the keys so that I can do the basic action, which is type in the username. That's what these things do. Logically, they're typing the username into a physical page. That's what I'm going to refactor out. So because this doesn't exist, let's get rid of it. And I will re-enable it as we start making this functionality happen. I'm going to create the class login page. Now I'm going to put it in the main code. And I'm going to have it, let's have it in the tracks. That defines the destination package just now. I try and put the page objects. I try and put the page objects into my code base and not my test layer, because this is abstraction code that I'm going to want to use possibly across different tests, possibly across different projects. Back here. So this question about could I put it in one code line? I probably could put it in one code line, but I just split this up to make it easy. So now we can see that I don't have a constructor on there, so let's create the constructor. Now, this is the way that I tend to code. I tend to code by creating code that doesn't work and then have the IDE help me. I just find that that makes things faster. And it also feels a bit more like test-driven development, even though it isn't. So I will say this dot driver, driver, because I know I'm going to reuse that. And we'll create this field. It's the one thing I hate about my keyboard. The Windows field key is too close to my Alt key. Driver code in there. So let's go back to test and see what we have to do now. So I've got the first line done, and I have a page object that takes in the driver. Now, theoretically, I could keep running this test to make sure it still works, but at this point, there's no real point because it doesn't functionally do anything different. So now I'm going to do the type username. Now I could amend this page a little bit to make it easier to refactor, so I could put these things into a logical order, highlight them, and refactor in the method. But I'm just going to do this slowly just now. I've pressed the wrong key again. But at least no one noticed. So this type username is going to actually do the work. So let's take the code that we had in here for the username and stick that in the page object. Now I'm doing this manually, so it's a bit prone to error, but to pull in that login text field as well. This is also partly why I split up the test with those comments the first time through, so it'd be obvious what I was bringing across. Now the last thing to bring across is actually doing the work to type in that value. And we haven't got the tracks username because we're putting the username in. Now, so there are a couple of interesting things that have happened here. What we have in the test is we have the actual doing code, which we're now refactoring out, but we also have our test knows about the domain object. My login page doesn't know about a domain object. So when I use this type username, I have to pass the username of the domain object in. Now I could make the decision to, in this login page.signin method, pass in a domain object at this point. I tend not to do that. Done that in the past, I tend not to do that anymore. And the reason I don't do that is because I think that I want my domain object, my logical domain, to be separate from my physical domain. So I put my physical page objects, and they deal with actual usernames, actual strings for usernames and passwords. They don't deal with my domain objects. If I ever want to have something simple that takes a domain object where I've abstracted the username and password, then I will create a logical login process or a logical object that knows how to deal with the physical world. At this point, we're starting very simple, and we're modeling the physical world. That's what this page object that I'm doing is doing. So theoretically now, I could push this stuff up here, and we've now got a page object that types in username. Then we still have the old code, which sends the keys to the password and clicks. So theoretically, if I run this test now, it should still work. I'm going to do that. Doing that. is to make sure that I'm actually refactoring, not just hacking my code base. So I want to make sure that if at any point I get interrupted or I stop, what I've written is still valid and still working. Because a lot of the time when we come to legacy code bases, if they don't have page objects already, then we're going to have to push these page objects in through various seams in the code base. So what I'm really doing here is making seams and making space for this, but still keeping the legacy code base the same. So now we know I need to move on to the password. Now this is going to be pretty much exactly the same, so bear with me while we go through this code. So I know that I need to bring this password field in. And that's the wrong place. So what I'm doing is I'm putting the by methods at the top to make it easier to access, just in case I need to change these values later on. Theoretically, they could be in this method, because everything is done in this method. But I've made a decision, conscious decision, to move them up the top simply for maintainability. I know the next thing that I have to do, because this is failed in here, I like to use the IDE to guide me in what I'm doing. That's good, that's nice and solid. Now this bit is going to fail. Let's move that. And again, let's take the domain object out of this physical world. So now we have a test that is a little bit cleaner. It doesn't have as many page objects. It doesn't have as many locators hidden in there. So now we need one last thing to do, which is the login. And this is possibly the most contentious bit of this particular page object. So I am creating it very basic, and I am not even representing this as a click. The naming is important. The naming of these things is very important, but I have chosen to not name it sign in button.click. I'm calling it sign in, which I've argued with myself about this, but I've decided to go with that because it will make the tests look a little bit better. So I'm only doing that for readability. But I'm also conscious that because it's a very simple refactoring to rename things, I don't worry about it too much. Anything that is a very simple rename, I will do something that works at the moment, and then I will reconsider it later on. What do we have now? So now I can get rid of all of this stuff that we had as comments, because they don't apply anymore. Now our test is a lot smaller. Our test, I think, is a lot more readable. And I'm actually going to remove, in fact, what I'm going to do is I'm going to keep that comment in there. And the reason I'm going to keep that comment in there is because this is a block of work that says login. Now, a lot of people would actually have added a login method in the login page. I'm not doing that. And the reason I'm not doing that is that I'm modeling the physical world. And in the physical world, the login page, let's have a quick look at it. This is my login page. Physically, I have a field, and a button. I've got a whole bunch of other methods and messages and various other dialogues, which we'll cover later on. But this page logically has the concept that it helps me log in. But physically, it doesn't have that action. It has the action of typing something in. So this is where I wrestle with my conscience as to what has to go into the different models. So I'm leaving this comment in here because I think that at some point I will need to represent that concept of user.login, but I don't have to do that yet. So let's check whether this actually works. Now this is the simplest page object in the world. Now a lot of people, when they watch this, are probably going to be thinking, wait a minute, there's no synchronization here. We haven't really used any of the concepts in WebDriver, because WebDriver has a bunch of concepts to help us with page objects. Now in WebDriver, when you look through the code base, you'll see that there is a thing called a page factory. And in a page factory, I can have fields that I annotate with the by method so that I don't have to do this driver.find stuff. Now the reason I do this explicitly is because I'm refactoring from existing tests where this happened. And there's no point me really refactoring this work into here and then pushing it into an additional concept on top. The page factories, when you investigate them, and I suggest you do, are really useful when you start with page objects first. If you know that you're going to be automating a particular area, like if I started from the basis of automating this login page, so I'm going to create a page object for login page, and I'm going to create these fields in there, and I'm just going to annotate them with the by method, and then use the page object factory to get started. I could do that. But I'm choosing not to. I'm just seeing an interesting blue line on my screen, which is confusing. Okay. Now I could start with a page factory and do this, but I'm choosing not to. I suggest you look into it. Now the other thing we've got here is that I've created a very basic login page. It's just a simple class. I inject the driver. I inject the WebDriver in here. There is nothing WebDriver-y about this. Now there are classes in WebDriver for loadable components. There are classes in WebDriver for slow loadable components. And I suspect in the future, I will add that concept in here. I suspect that in the future, my login page will extend a loadable component from WebDriver, which is a basic concept that we have, which then gives us the ability to say login page.load. But I'm not doing that yet. I'm keeping this as simple as possible, because you can see that I have my navigation. I currently have my navigation separately from my page object. Now that's another thing that a lot of people do. They merge the navigation into the page object. And one thing you see here is my sign-in just as a sign-in. It doesn't yet return another page object. It doesn't return the main logged in page, which is what this currently represents. Now that's partly because we haven't created that concept yet. But even when I do, I probably will not have this sign-in method return another page object, because I try and keep the navigation separate from the page objects themselves. Because if I join the two together, if my sign-in method returns a page object for now I'm on the main page, then what happens when I do a failed login? I do a failed login and type in the wrong username and password. I'll still be on the main page, but my sign-in method will return a page object for the main page. Or I have to create some new objects where the main page is related to a common object, like a generic page, and then I can cast between them. So instead, I keep it very simple until I need that additional complexity. That's the one thing, if I stress anything here, and I elaborate this point in here, it's keep things as simple as possible and only add the additional parts when you actually need them. So what do I need to do to this now? So I've got a basic page model that helps me log in. So really, I probably want to add a new test for a failed login. So let's do that. I'm just going to copy paste this just now. I'm going to call it failed to log into tracks. Thank you very much in here. To make this failed test different, I just have to add in another password. So we've got a comment in there saying, Alan, if we failed to log in, couldn't I just return another object? Couldn't I return in a login page object? Now I could, but I have to then have all those page objects extend a particular common object or implement the exact same interface for all the pages to allow that generic part to happen, or make this a generic where I log in, sign in, and cast it with the particular object that I know it's going to return and create that object in there. Or I could keep my test very simple and have the test itself navigate and check for the right page at the right time. What I'm trying to point out at this point is keep everything as simple as humanly possible for as long as you possibly can, because the temptation is going to be to load up the login page with more stuff. The temptation is going to be to have a login method which takes a username and password and does the whole login, so that you can just say login page.login with these details. The temptation is going to be, wait a minute, we don't need to pass in those details because we have a domain object, so let's pass the domain object in. And at that point you start merging all the concerns in your code base, and you don't have the separation. And you're not going to see that that separation is important until later on when you make changes and you have to unweave all these parts because you've embedded concerns and there's overlapping concerns all the way through the code. And the easiest way of avoiding that issue is to keep things as simple as you can for as long as you possibly can. So, and the only reason I stress that is because I have made that mistake so often in the past that I now try and avoid it, and I now try and keep these separations, even though I know that when you go and look at the WebDriver codebase, when you go and look in things like Loadable component and slow loadable component, they embody within them the notion that a page object knows how to load itself. So when you start using Loadable component, it comes with a load method. So I could say login page, new login page.load. That's the concept that the Loadable component comes with it. I'm not entirely convinced that a page object should know what URL it exists at. I'm not entirely convinced that a page object should know how to load itself. When we start embodying those concepts, we tend to lose sight of the fact that you can navigate through an application, and we tend to create a lot of objects that go directly to pieces of functionality. And that's really useful. It's a really fast way of navigating through an application. But it may not be what we want. And I think at that point, we've merged the concept of navigation with the concept of allowing me to manipulate the physical page that I'm working with. So I'm trying to use page objects at the moment that embody the concept of manipulating the physical page, but not necessarily navigating as well. So now, if I fail to log in, which is what this will do, I've used exactly the same page object, and now I just have to change my assert, because this should no longer be true. Now I can't remember what happens when I fail to log in, so let's check. So I'm on the same page, and we get a login unsuccessful message. Now what I probably want is a sensible testing browser that actually lets me check the right details for the login page. So what I'm going to do very quickly is just create a very simple assert here. So I'm just going to driver dot current URL, and then I'll check that it ends with, and we've already got this concept. Oops. Track login URL, track login. Yeah, so let's call it that. Let's bring in Hamcrest core matchers. So theoretically, I'm checking that the URL hasn't changed. Let's see if that actually works. I'm doing this very crudely. Let's see if that actually works. Now the joy of using Firefox with all these tests is that it can take a little while to start up, which is why, where possible, we try and share the driver amongst our tests for as long as we can. So that is very crude. I'm checking out this little login page using the login URL. Now, there are issues with that. Hopefully people will be sitting there watching this going, but what if that happens so fast and we haven't actually changed the page yet, and we have gone to the correct page but we haven't changed the URL? Now, all these things are theoretically possible, but I'm hoping that these things are blocking because they're clicking actual links, or if I get to the point where I've experienced synchronization issues, that's the point at which I will add this additional code. Now, we are 35 minutes in. I appreciate that we tend not to cover very much in these webinars because I'm talking so much and going over basic concepts. So the next step that I would be doing is trying to make this more robust, because we know that URL, there is an actual message in here that is important, this login unsuccessful message. Now, I'm not sure that if I start down that road that we will get enough done, but let's have a look. So essentially what I want to be able to do is assert that. I'm going to write code that doesn't exist. I'm going to assert that the login page, because I think we're still on the login page after this. I'm going to ask it, is the login, how do you spell unsuccessful? Success. Oh. Is true. The issue here is there's supposed to be a method in the login page that we don't have yet. So let's create that. So you can see, let's just say false to start with. And that says, right. So that method isn't good enough, but the test is now clean. I could run it, it will fail. So this is what I need to work on next. And because I haven't embellished my page objects too much, I could use this when we've got a good login, we're about to do a good login or a bad login. It's just something physical that happens on that login page. Let's get a sensible browser up and have a look at that message. Remember the URLs that we're working with. There we go. There's a track stack. Let's fail to log in, just so we get those details. And there's my login unsuccessful message. So what do I want to do now? Well, I want to try and embody this in here. So I can see that, well, I can see, we've got this wrapper around it, this H4 flash alert warning. That's going to be the first thing I'm going to check for. I'm going to check, is this H4 flash thing even there? But because I'm assuming that that's a generic warning message, I'm going to do more than just check for the existence of that. But the first thing I'm going to do is check for the existence of that. So let's go into the login page. Let's see. Let's create a web element for this. Web element message folder. And then what we do is we say message folder equals driver, because we've injected that. Find element. Now, because I'm doing this quickly, I'm going to keep this in here. Now you can see I make different choices as I go through the different coding points that I'm in, and some of these choices might seem random. I've chosen earlier on to put all the buys up here. I'm choosing now to put the flash in here. Part of the reason I'm doing that is that we refactored all this from an existing test. So it was obvious that this needed to get pulled out into an area up here. I'm coding this as I go through. So I'm essentially making a decision to leave some tech debt in here just to try and quickly get something running. So what I want to do is, now if this element is not there, it will throw an exception. So I'm going to try to do this and catch the no such element exception, of which there are 2 of them. So we have to be imported. We have to make sure that we pick the right one. We don't want java.util. We rarely ever want to use java.util when we're working with the Selenium no exception. If you pick the wrong one, you'll get the wrong thing happening in your tests and you won't know why. Let's make this valid Java. Great. So now, what this is saying is, if we can't find it, then clearly there is no error message, therefore return false. Now if it is there, that doesn't mean that we have failed to log in. So I need another check. I need to say, is the message. So we found the element, but that doesn't actually mean that it's displayed. So let's do a check for that. If message folder is displayed. So if it's not displayed, then we know there is no message. So even it might be present on the page. I haven't analyzed that page in detail, so I'm assuming that it might be hidden in the DOM even when we start. So even when I do a find element, it might be there, it might just be not displayed. So I'm checking, is that message actually displayed? If it's not displayed, but it's in the DOM, we still haven't had that error message. So the next thing to do is if message holder dot get text equals, and we want the message that we saw, which was login unsuccessful. Now again, I should really be copy and pasting that from the DOM to make sure that I get it absolutely correct, but we're doing this quickly. So this is the only point at which we can return true with this login message. I need to see, is the element actually in the DOM? Is the element actually displayed? Does the element which is displayed have the message that I'm looking for? If it does, then we failed to log in. Otherwise, I'm assuming that it's false. But I'm not just living with is displayed because I want to make it much more specific. Because I believe, and although we haven't analyzed this in practice, I believe that this, because it's called alert warning, will cover different alerts depending on what the state of the application is. So I'm trying to be very specific here. So let's see if this test actually works with this new method. Well, very exciting doing live coding because you never know what's going to happen. So we're running this. Firefox is going to come up. And the test path. Great. So now we have a page object that lets me check for error conditions and good conditions. Now, that might not seem like a big deal. However, when I'm reviewing a lot of client page objects, you can tell by looking at the page object whether they're doing certain types of testing. Because this page object supports me doing unsuccessful work and good work. You'll see a lot of page objects that don't support invalid testing. You see a lot of page objects that just have a single login method with the username and password, which return the next page. And you can tell from that, because they're making weights and various things for it, that they never check for failed login, because the pages throw exceptions and all other kind of nonsense in the way. And it's also why I try and keep things very, very simple. So let me do this. Now looking at this, I can see that this is the test, because it's all the asserts. I like to have my asserts in the test. I'm a little bit worried about this, because that's repeated across both of these. So I think I'm going to have to add a navigation object. I'm going to have to add a navigation layer onto the tests. But I also think we don't have time to do that today, because you've all been very patient and we've seen that through. So let's have a quick recap of what we've done. So I've refactored tests into page object. I refactored this login test into a page object before I had another test using it. That's not what I normally do. Normally, I will create multiple tests which demonstrate the use of repeated code, and that will force me to refactor into a page object. But I wanted to make sure that we covered the basic concept of a page object in this. My page object doesn't have navigation in it. It's a physical wrapper on the page. My page object doesn't have the domain in there. The domain is kept in the test. The domain will be kept in the domain layer. You can see that I have over here in my page, my code, I've got a concept of a domain layer and I've got a concept of a physical world. I will refactor this in the future so that this becomes site or physical domain or page objects or something to distinguish it from a logical domain. At the moment, this is good enough because I only have 2 classes and I know what the separation is. I was able to reuse that page object to do supposedly what you might call a negative test. It's a functional test because it's checking the functionality of a error message coming up when we fail to log in. But some people would call that a negative test. That's up to them. I'll call that a functional test. But we're using the same page object without any changes to the domain because we're injecting an invalid password. So things for you to look into, which we haven't covered, but in order to get a better idea of the page objects, look, if you can, at the WebDriver code or do some searches for WebDriver and look for the page factory and see how you construct page objects with the page factory. Look for the loadable component and see what the extending the loadable component here would do to my page object. Look for the slow loadable component. Now the slow loadable component is where you add more synchronization checks in here. Now I'm a little bit nervous because we don't have any synchronization in here. This application is running very quickly. I haven't had to add any synchronization at this point. But it's the next thing that I'll want to do. I will want to add synchronization into my code because I'm not convinced that when the page is here and I type in the username, whether the username is even ready. This could just throw exceptions. Really what I want to do is wait for the right things on the page to be available for me to use before I try and use them. That's what the slow loadable component is really good for. The loadable component is really good for giving you a consistent interface for your page objects. So those are 3 things to look into. The page factory, the loadable component, and the slow loadable component. And feel free to analyze or discuss amongst yourself or think on my separation of why my page objects don't have navigation, why my sign-in will never return another page object, because yours might, and you might decide that that's the right thing to do in your environment. But I try and avoid that and try and keep things separate, and hopefully next time when we do navigation, it will start to make sense. So I'm going to leave it there because we've covered quite a lot, so thank you for your time. For those of you that are staying on, I will monitor the chat window and the Q&A window and try and deal with your questions. I will check in all the code into the Subversion repository, so feel free to monitor that. I will create a blog post when all this work is up there, and I will release the meetingburner video onto YouTube. So are there any questions for those of you that want to hang around? Otherwise, feel free to head off. We've done our 45 minutes. Thank you for your time.